Ugh. All right, let's go ahead and check out those YouTube analytics. Been a minute since I opened and loaded my last video. All right, decent view count on my last one. Looks like people still like the FX gaming PCs. Wait, what's this? R9 295X2 for the meme? What's good, you guys? C.A.S.T back with another video, and just like the intro showed, we're doing our next PC build featuring the R9 295X2. Shout out to the man in the comments section who actually gave me this inspiration. Now, it actually reminded me that this was actually, one of the graphics cards I saw as a kid and was like, dang, if I had unlimited funds, I would buy this in a heartbeat. But obviously, I was like 15 at the time when this thing released, and it was just a different time in PC gaming back in like 2014. Hands down the fastest graphics card on the planet for like a couple months. I need to look back at the timeline, maybe possibly like a year. Now there was a little bit of debate there because this was back when Crossfire and dual GPUs and SLI was a thing. So technically it was two GPUs, and people were like, well, in some use case scenarios, the 780 Ti inside SLI is faster, but those are two graphics cards. So it was the fastest graphics card on the planet because GPUs are the actual die, the graphics card is the actual card you slot in. So therefore, R925X2, fastest graphics card on the planet. It was drawing the same power as like the 4090 back like 10 years before through two 8 pins. So that's kind of an indictment now I think about it on the 12-volt high power. I know you guys are probably itching at the bit to actually see what this GPU looks like in its glory in this PC build. So it is finished for the most part. We're still waiting on a couple components, but as just a sneak preview, I'll go ahead and show you the goods. This right here is the actual PC in all of its glory. So I hope it kind of shows you what we're going to be going for here. Let's go back to the full screen because we don't want to spoil too much. I'm just waiting on the actual SSDs. I didn't want to go crazy on my SSDs, so I went ahead and saved up so I could upgrade the mains or the secondary storage in my workstation and gaming PC. And then I'm taking out those smaller drives and putting them in this one and reformatting them. Maybe I'll mess around with like Linux or custom installs of like stripped down Windows. Like I know Windows IoT for Windows 10 and Windows 11 is like a big thing. I don't know. I just want to be able to get this thing to be as fast as possible on a graphics card, which is probably going to be a lot more difficult compared to a CPU. But we're going to try it nonetheless. But for this first video, we're going to be talking specifically about the PC case. Let's go ahead and show the picture again. This right here is the DarkRock EC2 PC case, and honestly I'm very impressed with it. So I'm not sure if I want to start doing like actual component reviews. There's a formula that a lot of people follow like as tech tubers, and I'm not really someone that wants to go down like the deep analytics of testing thermals and acoustic levels. I don't just want to be rinse, washing, and repeating the exact same information on a lot of these components. However, what I want to do is kind of tell you about like the ownership experience and what it's like actually building the PC case. So part of it's because I don't really have the test methodologies to do those type of reviews in depth as far as like modern hardware that I can throw in as a test bench, sound equipment and recording equipment to measure that kind of stuff. A whole suite of games that is like more modern that I can do like these thermal testing on, or necessarily the time or desire to do those type of videos. I just kind of want to build PCs. Your thought process should be like, if I'm doing a review on it, it's decent enough as far as thermals and sound performance for I think the average person to actually enjoy. So the thermals on this, I have no question, are going to be good. You can literally make the worst thermal performing cases have good thermals with a Dremel first off, but also just in actuality proper planning of how you actually go doing the whole airflow pattern into it. Might have to make a separate video on that specifically, but for this first video we're talking about the PC case. Now, when actually planning out this build, I wasn't going to spend like a crazy amount of money. It's very, very easy to like overspend on PC parts now. I wanted something that like if I chose to throw in a more modern GPU, it would instantly become like a mid-range, maybe like entry-level mid-range PC, which is a modern graphics card. So, modern platform around the older graphics card. I wanted it to use a lot of the components that I had in storage. So I had like an old AIO, power supply, so on and so forth, fans that I wanted to be able to throw in this PC case so I could just get them out from underneath my desk and put them to good use. but also the PC case had to cost less than $70. I was looking at the overall budget I had set aside for this in my disposable income, and basically I had to fit it in that budget to be able to afford everything else for this specific PC build. I was really looking at getting the Lee Sub-Zero One. That's like a gorgeous, gorgeous PC case, and would have been able to show off this graphics card very, very nicely in the front. But unfortunately, it just didn't work out in the cards, spending $120 or so on a case like that. So I thought this would be a good time to do a review on a PC case that, again, I looked at online, didn't have like as many in-depth reviews that I'm going to go into it. So what you're going to get from this video is just overall my first initial impressions, what I like, what I dislike, the good, the bad, the ugly, and just some overall build notes and something to take into consideration if you do buy this PC, specifically to do a PC build in. So the first thing I want to talk about with this PC case is actually the unboxing experience. And one of the things, I guess this might be just my specific lifestyle, but I really like how this PC was actually shipped to me. The material, I don't know if this is just a thing for all new PC cases, because again, the last PC case I bought was probably manufactured back in like 2017, and that was a whole different era of PC cases. That was in like the tempered glass box era of PC case where airflow just wasn't a thing. Then we went into like the fish tank case. Now we're in like the mesh airflow case era of designs. So yeah, I haven't bought a modern PC chassis in quite some time. I'm more used to like the single impact white styrofoam where like it'll protect your components for like one impact, but after that impact it will basically crumble. This is more like a, second, third impact kind of like reusable type of foam that's going to hold its integrity over long periods of time. Now this is important for my lifestyle because I am someone who's actually moved locations multiple times over the past 4 years. As someone who has relocated like basically from Midwest to down south to now the upper Northeast in this very quick changeover of years, having the ability to ship my components back and forth to actually keep up and have my desktops with me is something that I did quite often. So if you're like a college student going away for college and then packing your things up, especially for like a considerable distance where you would need to maybe consider shipping it through UPS, keeping the stock box is something that you could definitely do with this PC case. Now this is also my first PC case that I have owned with a tempered glass side panel. I do know like when tempered glass side panel cases were first coming on the market, they were very, regularly shattering, especially in like the cheaper price point. You don't really necessarily see that much anymore. I think the case designs have really improved since then. And this goes into the next talking point, which is that tempered glass hinge. I'm very impressed with the overall build quality with it. There was no like creaking or like lack of tolerance with how it fits on the rest of the PC case. It just slots in, has very even spacing around the actual end of the chassis where it's supposed to fit. The magnets are very strong. It actually has a metal border frame on the bottom and the top that kind of gives it that little bit edge of protection. Has a little fabric pull tab, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but I guess is an easy way to open and close your PC case without just getting a bunch of fingerprints on the side panel. And with this overall design and the hinge design, I couldn't really foresee that this breaking anyway if you were to pack it up and reship it. Obviously, make sure you pack the inside of your PC case accordingly so that nothing on the inside breaks. Maybe wrap like a small layer of bubble wrap around the actual outside of the actual side panel itself. But the way the foam was actually custom cut and put together to conform around the actual PC case and have a snug fit with both the case and the box, I really can't see this thing breaking anytime if you were just to ship it. So I went ahead and pulled up the actual website so you can actually see how this thing is advertised and what is actually available for it. This is DarkRock's personal website. Now over here we actually have the actual page where you can purchase it. I believe I purchased mine for like $57, but it goes for roughly around like that $60 price point on Amazon, and obviously you can buy it for $60 USD directly from their website if you want to do it that way as well. But they're advertising this as like a compact ATX style PC. You can see the measurements here: 17.6 inches in height, 8.6 inches in diameter, and 15.1 inches in depth. So I comparing this to my actual mid-tower proper full-size mid-tower ATX cases, it's considerably shorter and considerably not as deep, more shallow. As far as the depth goes, it's roughly the exact same, maybe a little bit more compared to my older style cases, but compared to modern ATX style cases, it's going to be roughly the exact same. So your cable management should be relatively equivalent. This, however, I feel is like a good equal middle between like a mini tower, because a mini tower case is technically only supposed to support of max of micro ATX motherboards. I know Lian Li has like their one-off compact or like mini towers that they have on the market that because they relocate the power supply to different locations, they can get away with a full A-size ATX. But traditionally, a mini tower is ATX motherboards and smaller. So this is like a compact ATX motherboard or case that supports full-size ATX motherboards, but not really too much else as far as like componentry, where you're gonna have like super tall CPU coolers, super long GPUs because it is more compact. How they advertise it though, there's a decent amount of hardware that you should be able to fit in here. So they're advertising 340 millimeter length graphics cards, up to 165 millimeter height CPU coolers, and 360 millimeter radiators mounted at the front as well. Mesh front air panel airflow, so it provides plenty of cooling for here. The way the actual front panel is designed, I will say that I do really like the front panel. It reminds me of a speaker system. If I had to actually, look at this, um, if you were to put this next to like your media center or like a home theater or even on your desk, I think a lot of people could mistake this at first glance for a speaker system just with this front grille. And I really do like kind of this more minimalistic look. Plenty of front airflow, but it's not just your standard flat front panel that every other PC case looks like. It gives a little bit of depth, a little bit of angularity to it that gives it a little bit more character and makes it look a little bit more appealing to the actual to the end user. As far as the front I/O panel, you have your power reset, USB Type C, and then two USB 3.0s. Actually, it advertises as USB 2.0, but I can't confirm that on my specific PC case it came with two USB 3.0s. So I guess that was a little bit of oversight there. Maybe this is an updated revision on the case that I got compared to when this was first advertised, but mine has two USB 3.0 connectors at the top. It also is advertising, I believe, 200 millimeter length power supplies. Let me see where they actually have that say. I think it might be in one of these pictures on here. Oh yeah, right here. So 200 millimeter PSU length supported. And also you have 3.5 millimeter drives, two pieces of them, or two 2.5-inch SSDs that you can mount here. You have mounting provisions on the back of your PC case behind the actual motherboard, mid plate, and then you also have your SSD mounting tray at the bottom here as well. So overall, I would say this thing advertises quite a bit of componentry that you can actually fit inside of here, which is always nice to see. But obviously, once you buy the PC case, certain things aren't always as they seem. So let's go ahead and talk about the things that I like about this case, the good, the bad, and the ugly. First thing I really like about this PC case, obviously that front mesh panel. It looks really, really clean. And it also stands off a decent amount to where, airflow on the inside of this PC case is actually really good while you still get good dust filtration and low acoustics. 1 millimeter diameter spacing on the front mesh panel, and space off that front mesh panel enough off of the actual fans to where you're not going to be impeding the airflow in any way, shape, or form. I think around like the 10 centimeter mark, 10 to 15 centimeters, like roughly half an inch of spacing should be sufficient for you to get good airflow on those case fans where you're going to get good dust filtration, but you're actually not going to be impeding on the actual performance of the airflow and increasing the actual acoustic levels. If you have 1 millimeter spacing on the actual front panel and mount that directly up against a fan, it's going to cause much more turbulent airflow. It's going to be much louder, and it will kind of limit the airflow they actually get. But when you space it off there, you will significantly lower the actual dB level, especially when those fans spin up to higher speeds, and you will still be able to get good airflow while keeping the same dust filtration. You're essentially creating like a vacuum, creating like a negative air pressure pocket in between like the front mesh panel and where the actual fans sit. So you're able to bring in, just naturally like vacuum in air to the front of the case while ventilating the actual air that comes in, so dust won't as easily get inside your PC case, which is obviously really nice. It makes it really easy to clean. Just take that front panel, pop it off, air dust it out, and you're good to go. The spacing on there actually will support 30 millimeter fans and still be able to support that same thing I was talking about with good airflow patterns with 30 millimeter thick fans. So if you wanted to get something like RS120s by Corsair or like Fantex T30s or any other type of 30 millimeter thick fan, you could take advantage of the cooling properties that those have an advantage over your standard 25 millimeter thick fans. Now, personally, I would say like you have to consider yourself, is it worth spending $80 for a pack of 3 of these 120 millimeter, 30 millimeter thick fans? Or, for a PC case that costs 60 bucks? Probably not. I'll leave a screenshot of the PC case fans that I have in this one. I think they're branded by PC Cooler, but they're pretty good static pressure, good RPM up to like 2200 give or take. And they have a really good bearing design. I think it's a double ball bearing, PWM, daisy chainable, and I got each one as like 3 pack was like $30, $29.99. So I would recommend like look around the $10 price point for like high performance, but good value oriented fans, either the PC cooler fans like I have in mine. Obviously, all the fans of Arctic make are really, really good. Arctic P12s, Arctic F12s, Arctic P12 Maxes, whatever you might need for that your specific use cases. Getting a good quality performing fan around the $10 price point per fan is going to be your best option for this PC case. But yeah, it does have support for 30mm thick fans if you do want to throw them in there at some point. And while the actual PC case is made of like a cheaper material, a cheaper sheet metal, the way it's actually constructed together and the actual bare chassis itself, while light, is very, very rigid. I took off all the side panels, the back side panel, the tempered glass panel, and the front mesh panel. And just by holding the bare chassis and trying to flex it back and forth, there was literally little to no flex, or really no flex at all in the bare chassis. That's what you really want to see with a PC case like this. The way that the top panel mounts to the front panel and the bottom, the way this whole all constructed together just makes for a very solid chassis. So although it is a cheaper material, they put the right bends and reinforcements inside this chassis to keep it really, really solid. As far as the bad and the ugly, I'll kind of like group these both together because I haven't really found anything that's like a deal breaker for the specific PC case. But when looking back, if I was like a novice builder, this was my first PC case, I could see some of these things as being major issues with the overall experience. So let's go ahead and talk about that top panel where the magnetic filter is mounted. I don't know if I'm just OCD, but like the fact that if I remove that top dust filter, it just looks really ugly. It could just be the fan screws I'm using for my 240 rad that I mounted at the top for this specific build. But just the way it's designed, the way it's like recessed to make the actual dust filter sit flat on the top, I'm just not a fan of the overall airflow and like fan mounting like holes that are actually put there. Now, the easy solution for this would just to be leave the magnetic dust filter on top. But the dust filter can be kind of restrictive. It's not the biggest deal, but when putting it on there, you will notice a decent amount of airflow decrease, and you will notice an increase in noise in comparison to when you have it fully removed. Now, that's just kind of the nature of these style of dust filters. Unlike the front panel that has 1mm spacing for the mesh front, the dust filters have like 0.5 or like basically half of the actual diameter for each individual hole in the top of the dust filter, which can get to the point of where it is restricted even if it is spaced off to some extent from the actual fans. Now, with the dust filter, if you were to mount a fan directly to that frame at the top of the case, that filter is going to sit directly on there and it will basically not have the same effect that the front mesh panel does. So I would have preferred if they have like the dust filters that have like the same spacing of diameter for each individual hole like the front panel does. And I think that would have worked a lot better for both airflow and acoustics. Maybe not so much for dust filtration, but again, I'm someone that doesn't really feel that the top of a case really needs to be filtrated or filtered like that because you're basically filtering an exhaust. You would basically the way it's designed is you would have a front intake and you would have like a top intake as well to make that dust filter functional. But the way they advertise it, if you look back at the website, the top is advertised as being an exhaust. And that's the way I have it set up in my specific build. And I think that's the way most people would set it up for their specific builds. Filtering an exhaust on a case really does not make that much sense. You're essentially trapping dust inside your PC case at the expense of better airflow and better acoustics. So I personally would have just preferred if like they refinish the top of this case to make it look more appealing or made the dust filter, that top kind of panel, larger porosity or better porosity for better airflow, better acoustics, or just like not had a dust filter mounted up there at all. Now the easy fix to this would just be don't include the dust filter, just take it off. But again, it's really ugly. It just bothers me how the top of this case looks without the PC filter. So maybe I'm just OCD. Again, it's not that big of a deal. At the end of the day, if it is function over form and you do want to have like unobtruded, unobstructed exhaust, just remove the top dust filter. When you're sitting at your PC desk and doing work, like no one's going to be looking at, you're not going to be like looking at the top of your case every single second. So maybe a solution for, this case is to remove the dust filter whenever you're using it, and then put it back on when you're not. I don't know. Again, for a $60 case, it's not the biggest deal. But for me personally, it doesn't make that much sense to put a filter on an exhaust, especially how it's advertised for this. Now, if you put it as intake, you would have a significantly high positive air pressure inside your PC case, which might be the way to go depending on your specific PC build. But yeah, I'm just not a fan of that top filter. Another thing that just seems like a weird choice for this PC build was the rear exhaust. The actual fan grill, the protective grill that's usually used, that you see on the back of the chassis. You usually see the same tooling that we would have seen at the top of the case. Where you have your fan mounts, where it's just like a frame with like that honeycomb or like circular cutting in the back to allow air to exhaust. This one, however, doesn't have that. It's just a completely open circle on the back of the PC case that is just wide open. And the actual fan grill is like one of those cheaper wire fan grills that you could buy on like Amazon for like $3, or it will come with some certain PC fans that you just screw on directly to the actual fan itself. So you have your fan, it mounts to the chassis, and the actual grill is separate that you screw on from the other side. So you have to like sandwich it in place. And the only way I really notices this is because I removed the stock fan on the rear. If I hadn't removed the stock fan, I probably would not have noticed this. I think there's a picture on their website that does show this, but it's not advertised that way. And for the average consumer, they probably aren't going to notice this, but it was a really weird design choice. I assume that this like knocked off a certain percentage of money for every certain amount of units that they have manufactured. Once you get into like the thousands and like tens of thousands of PC cases that are like manufactured and sold, there probably is some sort of like reasonable cost savings measure that they are achieving with this to be able to hit that dollar price point. But again, it just seems like not really worth it at the end of the day. Now, to play devil's advocate, I'll try to, show them some grace, even though I know this wasn't the design intent. Technically, that rear grill is going to be better for airflow and acoustics, especially for that stock fan. Now, I haven't done any testing on the stock fan, but you can consider pretty much any stock fan that comes with a PC case in this price category trash, or close to trash when it comes to airflow characteristics for CFM and static pressure. Depending on that rear design of your case, as we stated before, you can really hinder the actual turbulence of the airflow and the noise that your case makes if you have not the best porosity on the back of your PC case. Well, with the fan grill that's in kind of the wireframe design, you pretty much have no impedance whatsoever on a fan at all, in any measurable sort of way. It allows for much more laminar airflow, and even then, it's like kind of has a little more of a spacing off the back of the case. I'll kind of show a picture of it, the actual fan grill, to where it allows for just perfect good airflow and like no adjustments or whatsoever to the actual noise that the fan makes. So essentially, you could be arguing that with the stock fan that they provide, we're able to get the most performance out of that stock fan without having to upgrade it. If you were to throw in like a higher performing fan, like a Arctic P12 or something like that, it probably would not have make it that big of a difference at all, in comparison to like putting on a normal case. But for a cheaper fan like this, you could make the argument that yeah, I can run the stock fan at a lower RPM and still get better cooling performance with the way this fan grill is designed. I already know that's not the thought process that they had when they made this design feature, but it is there, so I guess it's something to worth mention. Now, keep in mind if you do mount too thick of radiators at the top, you might not be able to fit your actual rear 120 millimeter fan, and depending on certain people's builds, they actually don't have a 120 millimeter fan in the back of their case. So with this case, you're basically forced in having one. If not, you're just gonna have an open circle in the back of your case, which is not appealing to anyone. So I don't like the idea that you're basically forced into having a rear exhaust, but I guess it is what it is, unfortunately. And then the last, small complaint I have is going to be with the actual fan panel screws on the actual for the back panel that covers up your actual cable management. Those are actually just plastic thumb screws, so it's like a plastic molding put around a normal screw. Again, cost savings measure, I'm sure there's some sort of cost savings that once you start manufacturing these things in bulk, you are able to hit your revenue mark that you want to hit. So it's a touch point, however, and I wasn't the biggest fan of it, but if you handle it with care, how often are you going to be taking your side panel off your case once your PC build is complete? For someone like me, probably more often than the average person, but I'm willing to let it slide. A lot of these things are like hill of beans, mountains out of molehill type of things that I'm making for a $60 case and should be relatively acceptable. So let's go ahead and talk about how this PC case is advertised supporting hardware, as this is really one of the things that you're going to have to consider if you're going to do any sort of big PC build in here. This is someone like, you're looking to max out the cooling and do it exactly the way that these things are advertised. And I don't really think it's the PC case build, or PC case to use for that specific type of build, but let's just go ahead and get into the nuances. So if I go ahead and go back over to my main screen and show you how I actually have this thing set up, you can see here that we have a pretty long length graphics card. The R9 295X2 is a 304 millimeter length graphics card. You can see I have a 240 millimeter radiator at the top. Wait, is that a 240 mil rad mounted to the 295X2? We'll get into that separately in a separate video. But we have 240 at the top, 360 at the front, full size ATX motherboard, pretty decent length graphics card. All the fan mounts are pretty much occupied. This is basically how I try to get most of my PC builds to look, where every bit of open space or empty space inside your PC case is efficiently used, but still not crammed. Every single part has its component, has its space to show off its components. The graphics card isn't crowded, the cooler's not crowded, the fans aren't crowded. However, there isn't a lot of empty space in here. So it's pretty tight knit when you look at like the cable management and like the clearance for certain different things inside this PC case, but still spaced out enough to have a really clean aesthetic. So this is like ideal situation, I feel like, as what you can get the inside of this PC case to look like. But in all honesty, guys, there's a lot of compromises that will have to be made if you aren't super careful or super lucky or fortunate to just have things aligned as far as to getting things to fit. So the first part I want to talk about is the actual power supply at the bottom. This thing advertises support for a 200 millimeter length PSU. And while that is true, it would make literally no sense to mount a 200 millimeter length power supply inside this PC case. Number one, to support that length of PSU, you would have to remove the drive sled from the bottom of the chassis. Which again, you might not think that's a really big issue, but if you've looked at like how long those, actually how long a 200 millimeter length power supply is, how thick they are, sometimes actually a little bit longer compared to that, just based on the actual shell and housing, the build of that specific power supply unit. Then you have to take in consideration the additional space that your cables are going to take up. And if you have a 200 millimeter length power supply and use the bottom of this chassis, while the power supply will fit, when you start actually adding like more cabling and all that kind of stuff, it's going to, you basically have eliminated the majority of your cable management space to where it's not going to look as clean. Now the power supply I've mounted in my specific PC case is a Corsair RM850E, which is a 140 millimeter length ATX power supply. I think if you're going to be mounting a full-size ATX power supply in this PC case, keeping it 140 millimeters and shorter is going to be your best option. Now, for testing purposes, I did go ahead and mount a full-length, standard length 160 millimeter power supply at the bottom of my PC case. It was a semi-modular older unit that I had that I was holding on to at the time. And, routing those PC cables was actually pretty easy. But for a lot of the power supplies for a spec build you're going to be doing with this, and we'll get into this as far as like for cooling support, graphics card support, you really don't need anything more than like 1,000 watts in this specific PC case. And you can find 1,000 watt or 800 watt power supplies, anything in that range at that 140 millimeter length or smaller. So I think that's probably going to be your best option. That way you don't have to worry about removing that drive sled from the bottom of your case. You can leave that in place, and you'll still have plenty of room to route your cables and store them away in a way that's really nice and aesthetically pleasing, and won't run into any sort of interference with other components that you mount inside this chassis. Now let's go ahead and talk about that mid plate, because as you saw in the picture, I had two fans mounted on the mid plate down here at the bottom. And I think, for this specific PC build, having two fans mounted on this mid plate is going to be your best option as far as aesthetic wise goes. Number one, if you look really closely, you can also see that a lot of those, panel connectors on the bottom of the ATX motherboard are covered up by these fans pretty much entirely. So this is going to just clean up the overall look of your chassis in general. I think like a lot of these like compact ATX cases have these provisions for these two 120 millimeter fans to be mounted here. And while they really aren't going to add too much as far as air cooling goes, or rather than just redirecting fresh air that gets drawn in from the front of the case, mounting two like reverse blade or like RGB case fans in my case right here will just really add to the overall aesthetic, features of the PC case. But just something to keep in mind, if you do mount two fans here, you might not be getting the best cooling performance. The only cases on the market, there's only a handful of cases on the market that really take advantage of mounting fans here that will actually have a tangible difference in your performance of your cooling. This is just, again, going to be more so for SX or just rerouting airflow to certain PC components. But if you actually want to take advantage of these two fans here, the way to go about that would be to mount a SFX power supply in this chassis. Now, as we stated before, there's two magnetic filters, one on the bottom for the power supply intake, one on the top for the exhaust of those 220 millimeter fans. With that, dust filter on the bottom. If you mount an SFX power supply, even with the 140 millimeter length power supply, you're not going to be covering up that entire filter. So there's going to be a portion of that filter that will allow for fresh air to enter through the bottom of the case and be drawn in by the fans from the bottom of the case to be brought into the main chassis, or the main area for cooling different components on the inside. If you mount an SFX power supply in this ATX case, like with one of those mounting plates, the SFX power supply will basically float off the bottom of the chassis, which will leave that entire bottom of the chassis unobstructed. Those 120 millimeter fans will not be obstructed from the top as much as they are with a full-size ATX power supply. So you'll be able to kind of create that same negative pressure effect where you're vacuuming air, not just from the front, but also from the bottom to draw in more fresh air to your graphics card or other components on the inside of your case. So that's something to look in and consider. In this price point, does it make sense to get an SFX power supply? From the wattage for components you'd be throwing in here, yes, because you could probably find a decent, SFX power supply at the 700 to 800 watt power rating. Anything higher than that, like 1,000 watt power supplies at SFX size, you're gonna be spending, I would say, $40 to $50 more compared to like the normal ATX. And at this price point, that can be the difference in certain components. So for certain builds, doesn't make sense. But if you do want to maximize the airflow of these and cooling performance of that mid plate, mounting points for these fans, then going to SFX power supply would be my recommendation. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is that front 360 millimeter radiator. Now, while I was able to get it to fit on mine, there was a lot of just super tightness that I was just not really comfortable inside here. If you look up at the top, these front panel connectors, they are basically squished in place to the point at which, specifically for the USB 3.0 ports, I had to put a pretty aggressive bend on those to get these actually to fit. Now, I'll show a picture of the actual front mounting portion of this case. And you can slide those fans up and down on the front, but the way that this is designed to fit a 360 millimeter rad is for you to mount the fans on the inside of the chassis and not in between the front panel and the outside of the front of the chassis. That's the way I have it mounted on my case. That's the most ideal way to mount it because it will give you more clearance for your graphics card. The end tank where your tubes are coming off your radiator have to be it has to be no taller than 17 millimeters. Now that's a measurement that most AIOs are not advertising. If you have a radiator already in your house or that you're looking to use for this PC build, you can measure it, and if it fits, then it ships. I'll show a picture of what I did on mine. I actually cut some of the reinforcement for both of those USB 3.0 cables so I could get a more aggressive bend and not necessarily compromise the actual wires on the inside to where they're compromising the actual performance of the actual USB port itself. If you wanted to actually mount any 360 millimeter radiator on there without any sort of issue, you would have to mount those fans on the inside along with the radiator. So now you're taking out, 27 millimeters for the radiator because that's the standard length, plus 25 millimeters for your standard fan. That's 50 millimeters basically subtracted from the length of your graphics card. So now you're looking at like 289, 290 millimeter length graphics cards at the most. Now you should be able to find like a relatively competent graphics card at that, length. There should be 70 class graphics cards and 70 Ti possibly length graphics cards that are around that length that should be able to fit in this chassis. But again, those coolers are not going to provide the best performance for those specific GPUs. So you might not be, getting the most performance out of those GPUs. It just is a weird trade-off. And, what kind of CPU are you pairing to go with the 70 class card where you need a 360 millimeter radiator like that? If for cooling performance, I'm just going to go ahead and recommend this now. Like, either stick with air cooling, any sort of air cooler that's 165 millimeters in height and shorter. I think like the Peerless Assassin, the Phantom Spirit from Thermalright are like super popular, dual tower air coolers that are available on the market for a decent price. I think they would go really, really nicely with this PC case. Or just go with the 240 millimeter radiator. That's my personal recommendation because I haven't bought a modern air cooler in quite some time. But a 240 millimeter radiator at the top of your case is going to be your best option and not give you these limitations that a 360 rad will give you at the front of this chassis. By the way, the top I/O panel is removable with 4 screws, which is a nice 2C feature. Pretty much all the electronics could be removed from this chassis if we wanted to paint it for something like that. So for case mods, it'd be a really good candidate for that as well. Now, mind you, if you do mount a 360 millimeter radiator at the front, you basically probably aren't going to want to use RGB fans because they're going to be spaced down in the orientation to where the bottom of the mesh opening is going to cover up a portion of that bottom fan for the 120. So if you have like these really nice RGB fans, that bottom fan is not going to be symmetrical. It's just not going to be symmetrical in general with the front of the mesh and sit nicely. So, wasting your money on 360 millimeter AIO with RGB in that sense probably is not going to be worth it. So I would, see if you could find like a modern ish, budget oriented 360 radiator that has like the smaller end tanks. The one I have is the Ace-Tech based design, so anything around that size. But these high performance 360s, steer clear from them. You're going to run into more problems than not. If you want to have a high performance, kind of bling looking radiator, go ahead and get a 240 and just mount at the top and call it a day. Last thing we'll go into and touch on is the actual graphics card support. Now, while you can support 340 millimeter GPUs inside this chassis as far as dimensions go, it does not make sense to mount a graphics card that's that long inside this chassis, just based on the overall build quality of this chassis. Now, like I said before, the way it's constructed is nice. There isn't a lot of creaks and cracks, but the overall material selection and the lack of a GPU support bracket built into the chassis makes it so it's not really recommended for you to get a graphics card that's that long. Think about it. Most graphics cards that are 340 millimeters in length are going to be like triple slot coolers, extended PCBs as far as like the depth goes in the Z-axis, and they're going to be really heavy. So mounting that on inside this chassis is going to introduce like a lot of GPU sag if you just have it mounted in there normally. Going back to my picture of my GPU, there actually is a little bit of GPU sag here. Not that much because the R9 295X2 has like a super beefy mid plate and a beefy back plate as well. But since it is so long, that little bit of GPU sag is a little bit noticeable when you get down to this length here. So even if you had like the most rigid of rigid graphics cards that is like 340 millimeters in length, once you get to like this length over here, it's going to start sagging a decent amount to where it's not going to be that appealing. So they do make provisions for GPU support brackets that you can just put in any case. They're magnetizers that go on that mid plate and stick it up and like hold the GPU in place. I'm not a fan of those type of solutions because I just don't think they look as clean and elegant. PC cases having some sort of GPU support bracket built into them that support these long of GPUs is just kind of a standard nowadays. So it's a shame that a modern case like this does not have a support for that. I feel it would have been relatively easy. It has the mounting holes for a 2.5-inch drive on that, mid frame inside this case. Being able to have like a little bit like another drill out or cutout to be able to have like an L-shaped, sheet metal piece that you could, screw on to support your GPUs wouldn't have added that much cost, but it probably would have offset the cost of savings that they had for all the other shortcomings that they did to make this case as cheap as possible. Again, for a case that's $60, are you going to be pairing like a triple slot 70 Ti 80 90 class card in this? Probably not, no. But again, I don't think you should be advertising. I don't know. It just seems like oversight to me. So while you can fit it, I personally wouldn't recommend it. And if you do find it, have some sort of GPU support mounting option because it isn't natively in this case from the factory. So what are my overall build recommendations? Well, I'll go ahead and provide two solutions, one air cooled and one water cooled. For air cooled solution, I would get, a really good quality air cooler that fits in the overall size dimensions that's provided, 165 millimeters or shorter. I will mount 240 millimeters airflow fans at the top of the case as intakes. And I'll mount three 120s at the front of the case, RGB fans to give some sort of like aesthetic, color to this case. Or you could go like completely stealth, that's your option. But all intake at the top, all intake at the bottom as well. I would go with those mid-frame fans as well, just for aesthetic purposes to cover up those connectors on the bottom of your motherboard. And that would be all positive air pressure. Keep the stock fan at the rear of the case and just keep it like a static 1,000 RPM or something like that. That will provide plenty of air to get really nice positive air pressure and exhaust air just naturally out all the orifices out the back of the PC case to provide plenty of cooling for your SSDs, your GPU, any other components you have mounted in your PCIe slots. I will basically do the exact same thing for water cooling. However, replace the air cooler with a 240 millimeter radiator, and I will set it up as an exhaust in this specific case. I guess you could do an intake as well, but again, I think just the exhaust to get that, pressure, like the normal airflow pattern as, intake on the front, exhaust in the rear, just have a real nice balance setup. That will probably be the best for managing dust on the inside of your PC case. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the DarkRock EC2. Would I recommend it? Yes, again, like I said, I think the overall PC build came out really, really nicely. I think it was the perfect case to have for this specific build. So that's going to cover it for this review, guys. Again, more videos to come, specifically on the graphics card and on this PC build in general. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Catch you in the next one.